At 63, I stood in the driveway of a house I'd owned for 22 years, holding a hockey bag stuffed with shirts and a winter coat, while my son-in-law leaned against the porch railing with his arms crossed and watched me like I was a problem that had finally been solved. It was the second week of January. My breath came out in small clouds. The temperature had dropped to -19 overnight, and the snow on the front steps hadn't been shoveled because I was usually the one who did that. My wife stood just inside the storm door, one hand on the frame, not quite looking at me and not quite looking away. "It's just for a little while," she said, "until things settle down." I asked her what exactly needed to settle. She didn't answer. My name is Irwin Mackay. I was 63 years old when my wife of 14 years asked me to leave our home in Barrie, Ontario, because her daughter's marriage was falling apart, and apparently my presence in the house wasn't helping. That's how it was explained to me. Not those words exactly. The words she used were gentler, arranged more carefully, but that was the shape of them when you pulled the wrapping off. My wife and I had met late. I'd been widowed at 54. She'd been divorced a few years before that. We married quietly at the courthouse in Simcoe County with her daughter and my brother standing as witnesses. We weren't starting a fairy tale. We were two people in their 50s who understood that time was not a thing to waste and that a good person, steady and present, was worth more than most things you could buy. We had a good life. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market on Dunlop Street, Sunday dinners that went long, a vegetable garden in the back that I built the raised beds for the summer we moved in. I'd worked 31 years as a journeyman electrician, retired early, and kept myself busy with the property. New gutters one fall, insulation in the garage the next. The roof needed replacing 3 years ago, and I did it myself over 2 weekends in September with my brother's help. My stepdaughter had married her husband 6 years earlier. He was not a bad person. He was simply a man with more feelings than sense, and over those 6 years, he developed a habit of turning every difficulty in his life into someone else's fault. By the time things between them started unraveling, he had a list of grievances that included me near the top of it, though I couldn't have told you what I'd done to earn the spot. He and my stepdaughter moved back into our house in October. They had a 2-bedroom apartment in Newmarket, but they were behind on rent, and my wife suggested they stay with us while they worked things out. I didn't object. Family was family. I put their things in the spare room and cleared space in the garage for his tools and didn't say a word about it. November passed. December passed. He drank more than I was comfortable with and had opinions about the television volume and once told me the way I loaded the dishwasher was passive-aggressive. I let all of it go. I'm not a man who needs to win an argument. The night before the second week of January, I'd asked him carefully, plainly, to please shovel the front walk before bed, since the forecast was calling for ice overnight, and I didn't want my wife slipping in the morning. He told me I was always giving him tasks like he was hired help. My wife stepped in. "Just leave it," she said to me. "I'll do it in the morning." The next evening, she asked me to sit with her at the kitchen table. My stepdaughter was upstairs. He was in the living room, close enough to hear. My wife looked at her hands. She said she'd been thinking, and that maybe it would be easier if I stayed somewhere else for a little while, just until the tension eased. I said I wasn't aware there was tension from my side. She said he felt judged. I said I'd asked him to shovel the walk. She said it wasn't just that. She said he'd been talking about leaving her daughter, that he was fragile right now, that if I wasn't here, things might have a chance to stabilize. I want you to understand something. I did not raise my voice. I did not push back. I sat at that table and looked at my wife of 14 years, and I felt something I hadn't felt since the week after my first wife passed. The specific hollow feeling of being somewhere you no longer belong. "Where exactly do you imagine I'd go?" I asked. She said I could call my brother. I looked at her face. Tired, yes. Conflicted maybe, but not uncertain. The decision had been made somewhere behind her eyes before she'd even sat down. This was a notification. I went upstairs and pulled the hockey bag from the closet shelf. I packed what I needed: thermals, jeans, my work boots, my blood pressure medication, the charger for my hearing aid. I left my good watch on the nightstand. I don't know why. Maybe I thought she'd see it and call me back. She didn't. When I came downstairs, he had moved to the hallway. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The particular way a man stands when he's won something. My wife opened the front door. Cold air, dark sky, snow that nobody had shoveled. "I'll call when I know where I am," I said. She nodded. "Drive safe," she said. I walked to my truck, a 2014 Silverado that I'd bought second-hand and kept in decent shape. And I sat in it with the engine idling and the heat struggling to catch up. I watched the light in the front window. After a few minutes, the curtain moved, then went still. 14 years. And just like that, I was the inconvenience. It was a Tuesday. I drove north on the 400 without any particular destination, which is a strange thing when you're 63 and you've lived in the same county for 40 years and you know every Tim Hortons on every highway. I pulled off eventually at a rest stop near Innisfil and sat in the parking lot with the engine running. I thought about calling my brother. He lived outside of Collingwood, 40 minutes in fair weather. But he had his own household, his own complications, and I wasn't ready yet to say the words out loud that would make this real. I drove to a Canadian Tire parking lot near the south end of Barrie. Large, well-lit, a few other vehicles. I reclined the seat as far as it would go, zipped my coat up to my chin, and stared at the ceiling of the cab. I am not going to tell you that was the worst moment of my life. I buried a wife. I sat in a hospital corridor for 6 hours, not knowing if she would make it through surgery, and then learned she wouldn't. That's the worst moment. This was different. This was a specific kind of humiliation. The kind where you're not grieving a death, you're grieving a choice someone made, deliberately with a clear head, and you weren't enough to outweigh it. I slept in pieces. The cold woke me every hour or so. The heater in the Silverado was fine, but I kept shutting it off, watching the fuel gauge, rationing. By morning I was stiff through the shoulders and my lower back, which has bothered me since a fall I took on a job site in 2009, had seized up from the seat position. I drove to the Tim Hortons on Mapleview and used the washroom and bought a coffee and a bagel and sat in a corner booth and called my brother. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How fast can you get here?" I said, 40 minutes. He said, "Drive." My brother and his wife put me in their guest room without ceremony. She made soup that evening and didn't ask me questions I couldn't answer. My brother said nothing about it over dinner except, "You're here as long as you need." That was the first decent sleep I'd had in 2 days. The next morning I called my bank. I had a joint checking account with my wife and a separate savings account in my name alone. I moved the majority of what was in the joint account into my personal savings. Not all of it. I wasn't trying to strip anything, but I was not going to repeat the night where my card declined at a rest stop. I'd already done the version of that, where you lose access to your own money by trusting that people will be reasonable. Then I called a family lawyer in Barrie, not to start proceedings, just to understand what I was standing in. The lawyer, a woman about my age with a direct manner I appreciated, explained the basics in about 25 minutes. The house was in my name. I'd owned it outright before we married. Legally, I had not left. I had been pressured to leave. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. I thanked her and told her I'd be in touch. I didn't go back to the house, not yet, but I stopped feeling like I was the problem. My wife texted me that first week. Brief messages. Hope you're okay. Have you eaten? The kind of thing you say to be able to tell yourself you said it. I replied to a few. I'm fine. I'm at my brother's. The replies back were slower and then stopped. I called her on the Thursday. She answered, which surprised me. She said he was doing better, that having some space in the house had helped. I said I was glad to hear it. Then I said, I want to be clear about something. I didn't leave. I was asked to go, and I went because I didn't want to make things worse. But I owned that house, and I paid the mortgage on it alone for 19 years before you moved in. I am not the one who needs to figure things out. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, I know. Those 2 words. Not I'm sorry. Not come home. Just I know. My brother had a friend who ran a small property management company out of his garage. Within 2 weeks, I was doing basic electrical work and handyman jobs for rental units across Gray and Simcoe County. Nothing complicated. Replacing outlets, fixing baseboard heaters, caulking windows before the worst of the winter came in. It was work I could do with my eyes half closed, but it gave me somewhere to be every morning, and it put money directly into my account. His friend paid me cash, and then by check, and then, by March, was asking if I could bring my own helper because there was more work than he'd expected. I didn't have a helper, but I put a card on the bulletin board at the Collingwood Library. Within a week, I had a message from a young man named, and I'm going to call him by what everyone called him, which was Sully, who had dropped out of a trades program and was looking for field experience. I hired him by the hour and watched him work, and he was precise and willing to learn. That was enough. Somewhere in late February, my wife's cousin texted me out of the blue. We'd always gotten along. The kind of people who end up in the same corner at family events by coincidence and stay there by choice. Her message said, Hey Irwin, just checking in. I heard you two are taking some time. Hope you're holding up okay. Taking some time. I stared at that phrase. I wrote back. It wasn't mutual. She asked me to leave because her son-in-law needed the house to feel safer. I want you to know that, since I imagine the other version is the one going around. The cousin replied, Oh, that's not what I heard. I asked what she'd heard. She said, just that you needed some space for yourself. That it was a mutual thing. I set the phone down on my brother's kitchen table and didn't pick it up again for an hour. That evening I found my wife's Facebook. She had posted a photo of the living room, my living room, the one with the hardwood I'd refinished 3 summers ago, with a small arrangement of flowers on the side table and a caption that said, Grateful for peace and the people who choose it. 42 likes, 3 comments. Sometimes the quiet is what you need. You deserve calm. So happy to see you settled. I was not mentioned. The man who'd rewired the dining room ceiling fan and replanted the garden every spring had been composted quietly from the frame. I closed the app. I'm not going to tell you I handled it gracefully. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in my brother's guest room and went through every version of what I should have said, what I should have done, what I should have demanded when I was standing at the kitchen table, and she was asking me to take myself somewhere else. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, I thought about something the lawyer had said. She had said, He who says nothing eventually gets replaced by the story that someone else tells. I don't know if that's a legal principle or just something she'd seen enough times that it sounded like one. Either way, it was accurate. I wasn't going to let that happen. By spring, I had enough steady work to rent a small unit above a hardware store in Collingwood. Nothing to describe. A kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom with a radiator that took 20 minutes to warm up. But my tools were by the door, and the rent was mine to pay. and nobody in that apartment was going to ask me to leave because their feelings were delicate. Sully turned out to be good with clients, patient, clear, the kind of young man who explains things without making people feel foolish for not knowing them already. By fall, we had a small but consistent list of regulars. I registered the business, Mackay Electrical and Property Services. My brother did a small website on his laptop one Sunday afternoon. We didn't advertise much. Word in smaller communities doesn't need advertising. It just needs someone to do the job right the first time. One afternoon the previous October, I'd driven past the house on my way back from a job in Barrie. Just once, just to confirm it was still there. The front garden had been let go. The perennials I'd planted were still coming up, but the beds needed edging. The gutters on the east side had a sog I'd been meaning to address. Small things that accumulate when nobody's paying attention. 3 years passed that way. The business grew steadily. Sully got his certification and I made him a partner in the work. Not the name, but in the structure. We hired a third person part-time by year 2. Then one afternoon in late March, my phone showed a LinkedIn notification. My wife had viewed my profile. I'd done a short local news piece the previous month, nothing major. A feature in the Collingwood paper about the business and the apprenticeship work we'd started doing with the local trades high school. A photograph of me and Sully on a job site, both of us in hard hats looking like we knew what we were doing because we did. The LinkedIn message came 2 days after the article appeared. It said, "Irwin, I saw the piece in the paper. I always knew you had more in you than you gave yourself credit for. I'm glad things are going well. If you're ever in Barrie, it would be nice to talk." I read it twice. I always knew you had more in you. I thought about the January night she held the storm door open and said drive safe like I was leaving for an oil change. I didn't respond. Not that day, not the next. A week later, she wrote again. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. I made a wrong call. He wasn't doing better. He left anyway in the end. Moved out in September. My daughter's been managing on her own since then. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." I called my brother when I read that. He said, "Of course she's sorry. The plan didn't work." I said, "That's a hard way to look at it." He said, "Is it wrong?" I didn't answer. I thought about it for a few more days. Then I drove to Barrie on a Friday afternoon and sent her a message asking if she wanted to meet for coffee. Public, neutral ground. The independent place on Dunlop we used to go before it changed owners. She was already there when I arrived. She looked like someone who had been through a year they wouldn't want to repeat. That wasn't satisfaction on my part. It was just observation. We sat down. She wrapped both hands around her mug. She said, "I handled it badly." I said, "You handled it the way you did." She said, "That's the same thing." I didn't argue. She told me her son-in-law had left in September as she'd said, that her daughter was slowly finding her footing, that the house had felt very quiet since he'd gone. I said, "The house is mine. I want that on the record, in case we're ever talking to lawyers." She nodded. "I know. I never forgot that." Then she said, "I told people you needed space. I said it to make it easier to explain. I know that wasn't fair." I said, "It wasn't true." She looked at the table. "I know." I asked her why she'd done it. Not the leaving. I understood the leaving. I understood she was trying to hold her daughter's life together, and I was a variable she could remove. But the story she'd told afterward, the mutual thing, the space, the Facebook caption. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Because saying I asked my husband to leave so my son-in-law would be more comfortable is not something I could put into words without it sounding like what it was." "Which was what?" I asked. She said, "A mistake." I nodded. We sat there for a while. Not because there was more to say, but because there was nowhere to rush. When we stood to go, she said, "The perennials are still coming up, bigger every year." I said, "Plants tend to do that when they're in the right soil." We walked out in separate directions. I drove back to Collingwood. I had an early job the next morning. A baseboard heater on a ground floor unit that was tripping the breaker, and I wanted to check my tools before bed. A few weeks later, a check arrived at the office addressed to me personally. No letter inside, just a check for $300 with her name in the top corner. I deposited it, not because of what it meant to her, because she had more to make right than $300 could cover, and accepting it without ceremony seemed like the honest way to hold that. Her son-in-law never reached out. I didn't expect him to. There are people who go through their lives without ever really examining the cost their comfort levies on someone else. That's not my problem to solve. Sully brought on a second apprentice last spring, a young woman named, and she'll forgive me for saying this, who knows more about panel upgrades than I did at 35. We run 2 job sites most weeks now. The Collingwood paper ran a follow-up piece in the fall, and the Grey County Trades Board asked if I'd speak at their annual apprenticeship event. I said yes. I still drive the Silverado. Fixed the rear wiper finally. On mornings before a job, I sit in it for a few minutes in the driveway of my rented house. A proper one now, a small bungalow east of town, and I let it warm up. The engine turns over clean. The heat comes on without argument. I spent 4 nights in a cold truck in a parking lot in January because a man I'd never wronged felt uncomfortable in a house he didn't own, and because the woman I'd built a life with decided that was a fair trade. I don't carry that the way I used to. I'm not going to tell you I forgave everyone, or that it settled into something peaceful and complete, because it didn't. What I can tell you is this. The version of events they told while I was sleeping in a parking lot, the one where I needed space, where I went to find myself, where it was mutual and calm and everyone handled it with grace, that version doesn't exist anymore. I made sure of it, not loudly, not with an argument, just with time and paper and the quiet accumulation of what's actually true. I'm 66 now. I still know every aisle number at every Canadian Tire between here and Barrie, and I was never the one who needed to figure things out.